I'm building a kit for something I haven't done in a while. It requires a little bit more gear than normal, and like normal, half of my kit is actually backup. This is a French company that's expanding, and they have a new facility out in Newark that they're really proud of, and they want to feature that with shots of people in it. They sent me links to what looks like the only visual marketing they have, which was shot in France, and they wanted me to recreate it because they're really happy with it. First thing I noticed is all the shots are too wide because they're really focused on featuring the space over design. And there's a lot of windows, which means daylight is coming in around 6K, and mixing with CFLs probably around 41K, and some tungsten probably around 3000K. That means worst case scenario, I'm going to be dealing with 3 mixed light sources in some scenarios, and my goal is to get that down to 1. And I'm going to choose daylight because the CFLs inside are not very bright, and the common theme in their examples is completely blown out windows, because you're not trying to balance that with supplementary lighting inside. It also creates a bunch of other issues like color balance, fog from non-coated lenses, and this leads to excessive post-production, which might as well just be HDR. So I'm going to have to light bigger spaces a lot wider than I would choose to without an assistant. That means probably 2 heads in most scenarios, with maybe an on-camera flash as the third. And flash is the most efficient way to go here, so it's Interfit 500 watts for the win. And my Sony A1 is a stack sensor, so that's no joke. Its dynamic range by default is going to pull in those highs, which most sensors can't even come close to. And here's what we're looking at. It's anywhere from about 5 to 7 stops of difference, all kinds of color balance issues, which I'm going to overpower with daylight. And I want to be subtle. I want a nice mix of balance, so that the windows will still be high key, yet maintain some detail. In this scenario, that means bouncing off that little bit of white ceiling I have here. And that single head is maxed out at 500 watts. Yes, I could remove those reflections with 2 heads and really bring that background down, but I want it to be high key. I want the figures to separate off of it well. And while keeping that head in the same place, which is right about here, I can turn around and get this. Bring it over to the other side of him and bounce it off that light gray cinder block wall. And I got this and then this, without much of a color shift at all. Just got to remove the top of that head in Photoshop. It's a little bit too much for the Healing Brush AI to figure out, so I'm using the stamp. With the mechanical shutter on the A1, I can go up to about 200, 300 before I get clipping from the flash. Yes, you can use high-speed sync. I don't like the way that looks. It's a little too extreme. And I'll lose a significant amount of power, which I need in a room with this many windows. I'm going to stay around 250, and I moved one of those heads in that back room to light it because it was a dark hole. And just filled in a little bit of the foreground with my on-camera flash maxed out. And while I have those heads set up in the courtyard right outside this window, I can throw an umbrella on it, shooting through. I'll throw a polarizer on my lens, and use it as fill flash to counter the daylight in this outdoor shot. In this shot, the overheads were a little bit too bright, so I just turned them off completely, and took a different angle showing less of the space. In this case, less is more. Because the ceilings in most of the space are too low, this technique works well if you really isolate those areas and focus on small scenes rather than big wide open spaces. But that's not the scope of this project, so best thing I can do is get the heads as far away as possible and try to let the light fall in at a 45-degree angle. And it's not terrible like this, it just would be so much better if the ceilings had about twice the height. The light would look so much more natural coming down at a better angle with a whole lot more spread. And when I'm in a situation where I don't have to do that, I'm not going to. So the stats on most of these shots are shutter speed 200, 250, whatever it takes to get the windows in. And then I'm shooting around f4 to f5.6. And usually around ISO 1600 to 3200 in the unlit shots, and around ISO 200 to 500 in the ones with flash.